to another episode of Fully Booked. I'm Megan.
And I'm Shireen.
And it is the last week of October. Happy spookies, everybody. Happy Halloween to anybody who cares about that.
This week.
Yeah. Happy Halloween to anybody who, cares about Halloween, which is everybody who's sitting in this room right now recording.
All Hallows Eve.
Oh, we love it so much.
Yeah.
So we're closing out everything for Gothic Literature Month over here on the podcast. So we figured that to wrap things up a little bit, what we would talk about was really how Gothic literature has transitioned from the classic versions that we know about, that we've talked about in a previous episode, to now, and kind of like what modern Gothic literature looks like, and maybe how it focuses on slightly different aspects to a certain extent, or updated, I should say, aspects of what you see in Gothic fiction, but with, twists that are often for a more modern audience.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as we kind of advance over the years, as, we evolve in different ways, our versions of haunting and scary changes too.
100%.
What they found terrifying in the 17, 18, 1900s, we're not going to find it as scary now. We're going to be like, haha, that's just people getting, upset over something.
Absolutely.
We go to therapy for that now.
Yeah. To an extent, yes. And it's true that there is, modern readers and everything are quite desensitized in comparison to, people from, that's 100, 150 years ago, who would have been, who also, if you think about times like that too, obviously, there was less sort of an idea of free speech, and religion was much more heavily pushed upon people, particularly on the Western side of the world, but even in other places as well. And so that would have influenced quite a few of the stories that were being written and published around that time, because a lot of it would have had to do with more sort of slightly religious connotations of, and the ideas of hauntings and people not moving on to another life and things like that, and what that means.
And consequences based on actions that you're doing. And those consequences are often of a religious connotation.
Yes. Where if you do look at more modern Gothic fiction, and I mean I say modern, and a lot of people are thinking what, in the last 20 years? No, really more than that. If you think of anything past probably 1950 or 1960 to an extent would probably be considered modern Gothic.
Yeah.
We transition away from that, and we transition more into, again, coming back to it again, but we'll transition more into that Shirley Jackson-esque version of Gothic fiction, which is much more to do with the interpersonal relationships between the characters, and much less to do with there's a ghost.
Yeah.
Oh no.
Oh no. Yeah. And I think it's a lot more about internal reflection of self, and guilt, and kind of things that are coming back to haunt you, your own actions that are coming back to haunt you, or the actions of your family members or your friends. That's what's coming back to haunt you, and in a lot of the modern Gothic is the way I see it.
No, it's true. And that makes itself known just in even the settings tend to be yes. Is there usually a big spooky house? 100% there is.
Always.
Yes. But it's not a castle, it's more just a very, an older property, basically, that people are...
That hasn't been renovated in a long time.
Yeah, that's it. Or that had, we know has had something horrible happen there, and no one's returned for many years, kind of thing. And that's sort of what kicks off, that aspect of your story, as opposed to a very straightforward creepy Gothic castle in Frankenstein or something, an old ass scary spooky castle
or
setting.
Dracula,
that's it. You don't need it to be that anymore. You need a spooky house, because obviously, but you don't need it to be a giant cavernous space necessarily. You can create that Gothic atmosphere even with a slightly more modern house if the other elements and the atmosphere that's created throughout the course of the story are still Gothic-esque, basically.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny because as we're talking, I'm laughing to myself thinking about when are we going to get to the point where we've got Gothic stories about a giant condo on the Upper East Side or something.
There might be some.
But there might be some, and I'm thinking about, like, I know you're going to kill me, but like Colleen Hoover's Verity.
Really?
Yeah, because it's in this like big spooky house.
Oh, okay.
And like the Verity, who is the woman who is supposedly like unconscious and in a coma.
Yeah.
There's all these like weird happenings around her, and so it's like this big mystery of what's going on.
Okay.
And is there a haunting going on? And then no, they realize. Well, anyway, I'm not going to give away the twist, but
yeah, okay, fine.
Yeah,
no, it's true. Don't spoiler everything for people who might want to actually pick it up.
Right.
Yeah, and I think that, I guess what's kind of cool to a certain extent, like, not that none of this existed before, but that I find that now, like, a mainstream audience is being given access to more newer Gothic stories that are being published that, yes, might be period pieces in terms of, like, not be set in modern day, but still have a more modern sensibility to them, and are also more diverse than they used to be as far as the voices and things like that. Like, I think in the last few years anyway, if you look at authors like Silvia Moreno Garcia, she had already written like a couple of novels prior to this, but she had a really, really big upswing when she published Mexican Gothic, which, is a novel set in, I believe, the late 1950s, if I'm not mistaken, in and around Mexico City. And again, big creepy house, creepy people in the creepy house, and like scary things going on there. Right. And the lead character, she needs to kind of figure out what's happened, but it presents like a really interesting, different landscape. Yeah. As far as a Gothic novel is concerned, I read it. Yeah. It presents like a really different kind of like look and feel to the style. So even if there's a big scary house, like, we're still getting like a totally different flavor of where the setting is and how that impacts what the characters are experiencing and what the landscape of the story is because of that. And a lot of the time when they're period pieces too, they're set during some particular like socio-political movement of some sort as well, which definitely also adds to those elements also. So like, cause she's had a good few of those. There was Mexican Gothic. She'd also written a book called The Daughter of Dr. Moreau. Which is like an updated version, sort of the Island of Dr. Moreau, but like from a different sort of perspective anyway. So these things kind of present like an interesting new look at an old genre. Classic to a certain extent. And there's something like a book called House of Hunger by, Alexis Henderson, which is kind of an updated version of an Elizabeth Bathory story, sort of. She was a Hungarian countess in, I forget which century, honestly, who was accused of killing many of like her slaves and bathing in their blood in order to remain youthful. She was a big, for people who aren't aware, she was actually quite a big inspiration for Bram Stoker when he wrote Dracula, along with Vlad Tepes, who was the war lord, whatever you'd like to call him.
Vlad the Impaler.
Yeah, that's it exactly. Who he had written about. Elizabeth Bathory was also a very big source of inspiration for him when he wrote that story.
Ooh, that word does not belong with someone like that. Inspiration.
No, not particularly, unfortunately. But however, that really is the case. And when he was writing the novel, he was heavily inspired by tales of what she had allegedly done to people several years earlier. And I do think something that's cool as well, I'm kind of like on a kick of it, I guess, with like the more modern ones, I do think what's cool as well is that what we've gotten a lot of in the past like maybe 30, 40 years that's really added to that is the idea or the addition of Southern Gothic.
Yes,
in
that
there
has
as well,
come up, hasn't it?
Which adds like a whole other type of element and type of story, and also is very often modern. Yeah, most of the time, or set like that's it, like in a modern enough era, but has like a very cool, very different like flavor to it and style to it, and you're so much likely to get a really different setting in a Southern Gothic novel. There isn't necessarily a big creepy house, at least in the couple that I've read. There isn't always a big creepy house. Sometimes it's small properties in places, or it's like a place within a village or a town, or the idea, I guess, that a whole village or a whole town is haunted by the actions of past
I was gonna
people.
Say, like it's like they take that human interpersonal relationships and they apply apply it to a location.
Yeah.
You know, in
that's
the Southern Gothic.
And there's such an atmosphere created in Southern Gothic stories because it's hot. Like,
well, that's it.
You know,
right?
so there's just something
the
like
same, like cold,
no,
like
it's
chilly.
it's in the bayou and it's sticky and everybody's like, you know, like uncomfortable.
There's like a smell aspect that gets added to it.
Yeah. Oftentimes I think that's definitely part of it.
Part of the descriptions often.
Yeah, that's it. Like I you know, I'm trying to think of one that I guess like wouldn't have like a huge house involved. Oh, right. Okay. So I read a novel by Sherry Priest called The Toll, which is very much like a Southern Gothic kind of style. And it's really, it has to do, like, it's much more supernatural, but also involves, you know, that's it, like this bridge in this small place, like near a small town where people seem to just like, when they pass over it, something happens to them and they're just gone and no one understands why or what's happened to these people who just get stuck in this area. And it's sort of like, you know, a discovery into like what that is or why that is, which is a really interesting, again, totally different look. Cause I find that most of the time when I've picked up a Southern Gothic novel, there can be like an old, I don't know, an old plantation house, for instance, or something like that.
Is better to be haunted than an old plantation
like,
house.
You know, something like that's probably where your setting's going to be. But also, you know, the Southern Gothic, if you like, is mostly just for context, is mostly set within like the Southern United States, for instance. So it's like this niche that's come out of that area. You know, and if you think of, I guess, like the amount in certain areas, like places like Louisiana and things that have a lot of like voodoo. Yeah. And if you think of in like New Orleans, like, you know, what was her name? Delphine de la Laurie, I believe, who also was a woman of high ranking, quite in the 1800s, I think, who also was found out to have been torturing and murdering several the slaves.
What are you doing?
Who were working for her and for her family. Super fucked up. If you guys watch the Coven season of American Horror Story, Kathy Bates plays Madame de la Laurie. Yeah,
that's what I thought. Okay, because when you were talking about the other person a moment ago who bathed in other people's blood, I'm like, was that meant to be Kathy Bates in Coven? Because I knew that there was someone.
She's Delphine de la Laurie.
Okay.
Yeah. So that would have been like, and that was what she was found out to have been doing to people. Horrible. You know, so I think because like the South has these stories or these legends basically that have been created about this, it's really easy to flip that into fiction and make it into something else.
For sure. Like it's already got that like spookiness about it.
Oh yeah.
So it's very easy to set a story there. But, you know, as you're speaking, I'm thinking about, you know, nowadays a lot of our modern, and I'm saying like as of in the last 20, 30 years, 40 years, a lot of our modern fiction is very much supernatural. Yeah. And so, like, we no longer kind of toe that line, like we were saying in our last episode of the Gothic, where they're kind of creeping around the edge of, like, supernatural because of that religious connotation, but also because I think, you know, in the olden days, like, it was only, when was it, in 1645 that we ever had our first novel, or even after that, the Journal of the Plague Year. That was the first ever work of fiction because it was considered a sin to lie by the church, and to write a work of fiction would be a sin, right? And so a lot of Gothic fiction, like old Gothic, would be very towing that line between the supernatural because they don't want to come right out and say that there's something supernatural, right? But now a lot of our stories are very much, you know, vampires especially, you know, witches, like these types of supernatural beings. There are werewolves, but I often find that we're kind of, you know, circling around ghosts, witches, and vampires.
Very often, I agree with you. I think that tends to be what we get more than anything else, because I guess that because there's such a physical transformation with werewolves, I guess they wind up falling more into the monster category.
For sure. Whereas like the vampires, the witches, the ghosts, like it's like they could be there, they could not be there.
Yes.
Like it could very much easily be your brain like playing tricks on you, thinking that that's what's happening, but that's not actually what's happening. So like kind of like We've Always Lived in the Castle, how, Merricat's always saying she's a witch,
Yeah.
I literally thought she was probably a witch.
Yeah,
And then I
you're
realized
just like,
she's not actually a witch.
Oh, she's a witch. And then you're like, oh, no, never mind.
No,
never
mind. And so like, I find that in the modern Gothic, it's almost like, do we have that divide between, like, the supernatural and the Gothic like we used to? Mm-hmm. Or is it kind of morphing into a similar genre at this point,
Yeah, where there are elements, many elements of supernatural within those Gothic, or it's a supernatural story and there are many Gothic elements that are tacked onto it, as opposed to, like you're saying, as opposed to it being like a fully separate thing where it's just like, no, it's fully Gothic, or no, it's fully horror.
Yeah, exactly.
Or supernatural, whatever you'd like to call it, which is true. And I guess a good example about that, because we literally talked about this a little bit, I think, in the last episode that we were talking about Gothic fiction in, is like Anne Rice really falls into that kind of category as far as modern Gothic fiction that really takes that step into the supernatural, because the characters that we're focused on are supernatural beings.
Yes, exactly. And like, Anne Rice was probably one of the first ones who started to bring vampires into the mainstream, and made it like very popular. Like, I think there was a bit of a lull, and then there was Twilight, and then it was like, holy shit, now it's vampires everywhere.
Yeah.
But, I've heard many times that like vampires are meant to be like a symbol for like capitalism in our society, like sucking like the life out of you.
Okay. We saw this movie at a film festival this summer.
Oh God,
that was basically what they were saying.
Right. Well, yes, that movie.
There's a Russian film that we watched anyway at a film festival this past summer that basically used that exact idea that vampires are like the height of capitalism and they suck everything from the rest of society. Like, that's pretty much what the message was behind that film. That's basically what it was. So I think that for a more modern audience, it's not just a question of
like, this is a scary thing that's going to come kill me.
Oh my God, it's going to kill me. No, it's like, it's going to drain the life out of everything that it comes across, kind of thing.
You're like, oh, like, that is in some ways like, it's the way that we live in some ways, So I've heard that before, that, vampires are that symbol. And then going back to what we were saying about like the Gothic genre being like a commentary, like a social commentary, or like a self-exploration. Maybe that's where we're headed, is now we're using these supernatural beings as like symbols for like commentary on what's going on socially.
Yes,
otherwise,
it's true. No, it's true. I think that that's probably like a good way of looking at them. And then if you take that's it. You can kind of take, like, because a lot of Gothic stories have like certain political and social commentary within them. So now I guess our vessel that we're using for that, to a certain extent, to drive that point home with more modern stories, is whatever supernatural being or beings happen to be featured in any given story that's being published. So is it the vampires? Is it like, like witches who are running things behind the scenes because they can manipulate certain things? Like, is it any other kind of character? And depending on, it can be cool kind of depending on where your Gothic story is set. Because so many cultures across the world have so many different supernatural types of creatures, or like legends about them that are very common in those areas. So it's so fun that you can add like a more like local kind of style.
It's true.
Whoever the author is, like, like whatever it is that they grew up with, they're able to take a lot of like, what they were told when they were younger, and legends that are passed along within like their culture, their society, and use that. Like vampires, are kind of worldwide to a certain extent at this point, but you can, if you go like into like the southern Gothic, there can be like swamp monsters, and there can be like cool like different things that are only like sort of low.
What were you talking about the other day? Bog bodies or something?
Yeah, it was bog bodies.
Yeah. Like, there you go.
Yeah, you could make something very Gothic about that, because I don't think there's ever been like a full understanding as to how those bodies wound up in the bogs in the first place. Like, were they executed and placed there? Did they die in an area that became a bog like at a later time? Like, were they buried but then like unearthed by I don't know. I don't know. I might have to look more into it. Honestly, I'm not sure if there's any answer, but I don't know that there is a full answer right now for every instance of this having been discovered.
It's so strange.
I find it fucking fascinating.
I'm like, it's so gross.
It's very weird. Like, sometimes it's just, I don't know. So that's one of those things I find. This is a totally like different subject. Sorry, guys. But it's one of those things where like, sometimes I find like you find certain things out that like the earth can do, or that like organisms in the earth can do, or a particular like area is just prone to like doing this one thing, like, or it has like this one like reaction within the atmosphere, and it's just so interesting. Like the earth is such an interesting place, and so many interesting things can happen here.
Definitely.
It's just fascinating.
It is. It really is. Like, you know, life finds a way.
Yeah, pretty much. Thank you for quoting Jurassic Park.
Anyway, we're digressing.
Yeah,
now, so.
but it's true but it is true, like, to kind of bring it back around, that's it. In general, I think that, I guess, Gothic horror, especially now, newer stories that are published, are a pretty good way of commenting on society without commenting on it to a certain extent, simply by using the characters and their circumstances and any, you know, creatures that might exist within that world that's been created to make a point.
Definitely. Yeah.
So it brings it back around, and it's just interesting. I'm like, even, you know, I guess I think what I haven't really seen very much that would be interesting to come across more, and it's possible that there are some books like this that exist and I just haven't read them within like more modern Gothic, is that I'd be really interested to see something in a very modern setting as like with very Gothic elements to it. Yeah. And with like sort of add the use of technology to that, and just kind of see what that would do. How would that change the
that's
story?
What I was thinking, you know, when we started talking and we were saying modern, like, so in literature, a lot of the time when you say modern, you're talking about like from 50, 60 years ago. So we're not quite there. But like when you start thinking about like actual modern, like you think AI, right? Like you think like emerging technologies, and I'm sure there's got to be a good Gothic you could write about like AI taking over.
Yeah, that's it. Just how interesting would that be, right? To look at it from the perspective of like a fully modern story set with, you know, access to all of that all of those technological advancements that exist now. And how would that change, and could you still keep that story with like a very Gothic sensibility to it?
And there might be stories out there already that are like this, and we just haven't heard of them or read them.
Oh, totally possible.
Like maybe somebody listening has heard of it.
Yeah,
you know,
and God, like let us know. I'd be fascinated to see, like, that's it, like what writers have done with those sorts of ideas, like how they've taken them and what they've done with those to like really make like this Gothic story that exists within like a very modern and very like technologically advanced set world. But what do you guys think of like sort of Gothic fiction overall? Are you more drawn to like the older versions of it? Do you prefer like a spooky castle? Do you prefer like a slightly more modern, updated version of that? That focuses more on characters and less on like story arc, like whatever the situation is. You can let us know about that over on Instagram, on Threads, and on TikTok at FullyBookedCA. You can also check out our Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/book was way better. And if you're still here with us for Gothic Fiction Month, which I hope you are, please feel free to leave us a 5-star rating and review wherever you're listening, because it really helps us get the show out in front of more people. But until next week, guys, and a whole new discussion, keep on listening.
Thanks, everyone.